about, the class will be available for folks, and if they have questions or anything, they can contact me, but they can also refer to the lecture. So here we are in our final week. Today we'll be talking about a few poems that are all post-World War II poems. We already saw with the Samuel Beckett play that many of the concerns that we've been addressing all semester we're still with. So we'll be looking at poems that I feel sort of make the argument that although we've come a long way since 1800, in many ways, we're still dealing with a lot of the same issues. And I think that's one of the beauty of studying this literature, is we find this deep connection to history, but also a deep connection to problems about the human condition that we continue to wrestle with. So I enjoy this class immensely, largely because of you guys, but also because the literature sort of teaches me and shows me how I might be in the world in 2021 by thinking about how people were trying to be in the world in 1797 and 1850s, and then 19 whatevers. It just feels to me as though it all teaches me about how to what it means to be human, what it means to be in relationships with other people, what it means to be on a planet that has an environment, what it means to be in governmental systems that either offer or curtail our freedoms and our possibilities, all of these things. So anyway, are there any questions we have today? And then on Thursday, I'll just be doing a bit of a recap, and we might take some in-time class for you to do your teacher evaluations. And then I'll let you know about how the final will be structured. I will open the final on Sunday, and it will, our final time for this class is on Tuesday. So I will make the finals due by Tuesday at midnight. I believe I'm going to time the finals, but I'll give you lots and lots of time to do it. The reason is I did not find that you did better on the midterms by leaving it open longer. So I think I'm going to go ahead and make them timed, but I'll give you plenty of time. I'll make it something like an hour and a half, something like that, and it will be, should not be too long, but I'll tell you all that. I'll write it tomorrow, and I'll tell you all about that on Thursday, okay? Any questions about that? I know I'm not making, it's sort of like I'm asking you if you have questions about something I don't even know the answer to, but because I haven't written the final yet, but it will be, I think I will try to make it as open as possible. Any questions? All right, so let's go ahead and dig in then. I'm excited because we get to look at some pretty amazing poems today, but also because we are sort of approaching the end, and there's some kind of excitedness for me about reaching the end of things. So I'm sort of calling this class post-World War II poems, and I'm sort of thinking about it in terms of post-World War II poems. We begin with a poem that was actually written right at the beginning of the war, but has the war as its central kind of crux, right? So in this class, I've been talking about humanism and inhumanity. Like, is there something? The question for us is like, is there something not just animal in us, but perhaps inhuman in us that leads us naturally towards some of the problems that we've looked at in this class, whether it's slavery, poverty, discrimination, the kind of unequal unequal access and ability to have a kind of human flourishing because of economic and social and economic injustice. All of these kinds of questions seem to me to be questions about our humanity and the possibilities of becoming more human or being human. And if human means something like being conscious, then it seems to me that it means something like being connected to other people and having concern. So for them, a sort of social contract. And so what that leads us to are we're going to look at 4 poets. I have 5 poems here, but we're going to look at only 4. 2 by mid-20th century male writers, and then 2 by late 20th century and 21st century women poets. So we end with women poets. All right, so the first poet we're going to look at is W.H. Auden. W.H. Auden is a very famous poet in many ways. He does the reverse thing that Eliot and Pound does. He is English, and he moves to the United States and lives in the United States, mostly on the East Coast, and is an expatriate in that way. This poem sort of is looking at the beginning of the war, and to give you a background about, in case your history is a little bit fuzzy on this, after World War I, Europe was trying to rebuild, and in many ways was rebuilding, but then there was this global economic downturn and the Great Depression, which didn't just happen in the US, but was a global, it hit the US particularly hard, but it was a global phenomenon. And in Europe, what was happening is the rise of fascism. So the rise of fascism in Spain with Franco, and in Italy with Mussolini, and of course in Germany with Hitler. And not just Hitler, but the entire movement, right? There was anti-Semitism throughout the 19th century and the early 20th century. It wasn't like Hitler invented it. He just capitalized on it. There was nationalism, a kind of like go Germany, big kind of extreme feeling about Aryan pride and all of that. And the problem of immigrants and Jews and what were then called gypsies, but now we call Roma people. This was consistent, and from the European point of view, someone like Auden knew that there was going to be this war, that it would come to a head, that these huge powers would come to a head. And so let's go ahead and look at this poem. It's called The Bias, or Our Bias, excuse me. And it's a sonnet. It's let's go ahead and I'll go ahead and read it, and we can think about it a little bit. All right. The hourglass whispers to the lion's roar. The clock towers tell the gardens day and night how many errors time has patience for, how wrong they are in always being right. Yet time, however loud its chimes or deep, however fast its falling torrent flows, has never put one lion off its sleep, nor shaken the assurance of a rose. For they, it seems, care only for success, while we choose words according to their sound and judge a problem by its awkwardness. And time with us was always popular. When have we not preferred some going round to going straight to where we are? So I think it should be clear that the controlling metaphor for the poem is the clock face, which goes around like this, right? And there's something human about time, right? In other words, although like my dog knows when I'm going to feed it, so he comes to me in the morning and he comes to me in the evening and says, hey, where's my food? And he knows these sorts of things. It's not like he says, oh, we have an appointment at 2 o'clock. Are you going to get going on that? It's a human sort of concern. So if time equals the human, then sort of, I don't know what you would call it, kind of no time or sort of presentness. That's what equals sort of animal and natural, right? Sort of existence. So if time equals the human, then no time or present tenseness, presentness equals the natural in this poem. So, and I think what Auden is suggesting is a kind of split here between the human and the natural. And I think this is what this poem really is worrying about, whether or not our fixation with time has sort of kept us from being able to see what's really happening. And what was really happening, as I just said, was we were drifting into war. We were slowly moving into war. Another name for time, of course, is history. So the more we consider ourselves like historically bound, it may be that we lose touch with what is really happening in that moment, right? So if we look at just the way the poem is constructed, we see that the first quatrain really deals with the kind of conflict of the hourglass on the one hand, the lion's roar on the other, the clock towers at the one hand, the garden on the other. And they have two different ways of dealing with time. Another way to understand this might be to say that there's a kind of pre-modern temporality or time that equals something like human, a more natural human, right? So before we had clock time, if you were a farmer, you just get up and you'd go out and plant your fields when the sun came up, and everything was natural. You didn't need a clock to tell you when to do it. But now in modernity, we need clocks to tell us what it is. But then the second quatrain really sort of then begins to say, okay, but time doesn't really deal with lions. It doesn't really deal with beauty. It doesn't deal with power and beauty. Power and beauty follow their own kind of natural rhythms, right? They only care about success. We're too busy trying to be clever. We're too busy trying to be popular. We've missed something. We're too busy going round and round and round instead of going straight. So what's the upshot of this? For me, the upshot of this is to read this poem over and against Wordsworth's poem that we began with, Lines Written in Early Spring, right? For have I not reason to lament what man has made of man? So here we are dealing with poems that are, I would say, 150 years apart, 140 years apart. And we have the same dilemma. The same dilemma is that there is natural man and there's modern man, and the one, there's a mismatch, and we need to learn something from going straight to the issue, straight to the point. Does that make sense what I'm saying? That there's this kind of repetition in modernity of the same issues we were dealing with Romanticism. So I think this poem is a beautiful explanation of this. Any questions about this poem or comments? Okay, I would simply say there's a kind of, one thing that I noticed that you might have noticed too is that time is capitalized in the first two stanzas, and then in the final tercet, in this final, this would be called the sestet of the poem, these last two stanzas. Here, time is not capitalized. And here it seems to me that Auden is in a very subtle way, marking a kind of switch in the poem from seeing time as a personified human thing to seeing time as somehow, a personified, almost superhuman thing, to really reducing time to what he really, I think, thinks that it is right here, which is an issue of our bias, an issue of our measurement, which is partly bias means measurement, but you also know that what it means is kind of prejudice. So I think at the end of the poem, Auden is giving us an example by the movement of the capitalized, and then not capitalized time, for us to see that time is just one element amongst the others, an element that when we capitalize it and when we make it historical, we run the risk of, through our measurement, losing track of what's important, which is our power, our ability to accept beauty, and perhaps our capacity to see things as they really are, to go straight to where we are, right? This is like why people meditate, is to be here now, right? To go straight to where you are, to not be in your head thinking about the past or the future. And the wars, the upcoming war was very much about the past and the future, not about right where we are. So Auden leaves England, goes to the US, and is castigated for that. He left for a couple different reasons. One reason was it was easier for him as a gay man to be in New York than it was for him to be in London at that time period. But I think also he left because he felt like there was an inability for Europe, including England, and don't forget that there was a prime minister named Chamberlain who preceded who went and met with Hitler before Churchill, and came back and said, yes, I don't think he has any idea. He's not about war. He's just about whatever. So there was an inability for the political establishment to see what fascism was really doing. You know, they couldn't believe it. They couldn't see it. And I think Auden saw it and wrote about it. And he felt like the US, I mean, it's arguable the US didn't see it either. I think that's probably true. But anyway, he felt more comfortable coming to the US. And okay, any questions then? All right. I want to look at this poem by Ted Hughes. I wrote a few facts about Ted Hughes here. Importantly, he comes along and he's a sort of anti-modernist, meaning that he returned English verse. He turned English verse sort of away from Eliot towards back towards nature. He was very much concerned with the same kinds of things that you know, that the Romantic poets were concerned with. He grew up in Wales. He's a Welsh poet. And he grew up in the countryside. So Wales, as you know, is just another country, part of the United Kingdom, part of the UK, part of Britain. But it's much more rural where he was living. And I think he grew up with this same kind of romantic impulse about nature, but it's very, very violent in Ted Hughes. So you have to think about the violence at the same time, where Wordsworth saw beauty and interconnectedness. He saw a kind of social and species-oriented Darwinism, a kind of, he was very, very much aware of the brutality in nature. So he was, in that sense, different than Wordsworth, but in many ways very similar. And yes, he was married to Sylvia Plath. So those of you who are fans of Sylvia Plath will know that he is he's the foil of many of her poems, because he was not a great husband to her. But they're both wonderful poets. I think they're both very important poets. So let's go ahead and look at the poem. This poem is called Pike. And those of you who don't know, a pike is a fish. And this fish is, when I was a boy, I went fishing. I think we were in Arizona, and I was with my father and one of his friends, and we were fishing, and there were pike. We were fishing for pike, which meant that you needed to use a metal leader on your string, or a metal piece that between the fishing line and the hook, because the pike would bite through the fishing line. And what you basically have is a very, very violent fish. I mean, when you pull the fish up, it's got these very sharp teeth and it does not stop biting. And I was quite surprised when somebody next to us pulled one up and then pulled out a little baseball bat and then conked the fish out, because the fish was so violent. So if you've caught pike before, you know, or if you've fished for pike, you know, they're very like that. So you don't catch and release a pike, I don't think so. But anyway, this is before catch and release. This is how old I am when we were fishing for pike. All right, so I'll read this poem, and I think you'll get the level of the violence in the poem. Actually, let's listen to Ted Hughes read it for a couple of different reasons. One is that I have allergies, so it's hard for me sometimes to read well. And secondly, it's great to be able to hear Ted Hughes's reading of the poem. Oh, shoot. I used to have this one. Guess I don't have it any longer. It's all right. We can still hear it. I'm sure it's on. Let's see if it's here. Yes. Okay. Make sure that I'm turned all the way
up. Pike 3 inches long, perfect pike in all parts, green tigering the gold. Killers from the egg, the malevolent aged grin. They dance on the surface among the flies, or move, stunned by their own grandeur, over a bed of emerald, silhouette of submarine delicacy and horror, 100 feet long in their world. In ponds under the heat-struck lily pads, gloom of their stillness, logged on last year's black leaves, watching upwards, or hung in an amber cavern of weeds, the jaws hooked, clamp, and fangs, not to be changed at this date, the life subdued to its instrument, the gills kneading quietly and the pectorals. 3 we kept behind glass, jungled in weed, 3 inches, 4 and 4.5, fed fry to them. Suddenly there were 2. Finally 1 with a sagged belly and the grin it was born with. And indeed they spare nobody. 2 6 pounds each, over 2 feet long, high and dry and dead in the willow herb. 1 jammed past its gills down the other's gullet. The outside eye stared as the vice locks, the same iron in this eye, though its film shrank in death. The pond I fished 50 yards across, whose lilies and muscular tench had outlasted every visible stone of the monastery that planted them, stilled legendary depth. It was as deep as England. It held pike too immense to stir, so immense and old that past nightfall I dared not cast, but silently cast and fished, with the hair frozen on my head, for what might move, for what I might move. The still splashes on the dark pond, owls hushing the floating woods, frail on my ear against the dream darkness beneath night's darkness had freed, that rose slowly towards me, watching.
Okay. Very dramatic reading, right? You can hear the Welsh in his voice. Those of you who like older movies might recognize an actor named Richard Burton, who's also Welsh, and he has that same kind of tonality in his voice, that same timbre, and the same dialect, I suppose. All right, so I think you get the point of the poem. It's about the kind of violence of these fish and the way Ted Hughes plays with the human-animal kind of connection, the same way that that Auden had, and that I think Wordsworth does. And here, what he's looking at specifically, he's talking about being a kid and having, he had a brother, and I remember reading his biography. They sort of grew up pretty wild, and they kept these 3 pike that they found, these little fish. They've caught them and they brought them home and they put them behind glass, in an aquarium, and they ate one another until there was only 1 left. So this, I think, becomes, finally one with a sag belly and the grin it was born with. This becomes a metaphor for the kind of violence that might also be a kind of human trait or a kind of instinctual trait. And that, I think, is what the poem begins with. But then he has this wonderful break in the poem right here. And he says, a pond I fished 50 yards across. Suddenly we get this break. And he talks about the monastery that had planted the lilies, right? And then he says it was as deep as England. And he becomes scared of something. And it's unclear whether that fear, I've always thought that it was unclear whether what he was afraid of was outside or inside, like his own pikeness, right? And why do I say that? It's because I think this line where he says, but silently cast and fished with the hair frozen on my head for what might move, for what I might move. Now, when you read it, he's talking about that outside eye of the pike that he mentions earlier in the poem. But I, of course, can also be the first person pronoun for what I might move, right? So the fear is also that we might be so violent that we would eat one another, right? And then finally, that whatever darkness beneath the darkness might be watching us. That's like an unconscious darkness watching us. That's the way I read this end of this poem. So, right where I'm not saying anything in this. I wrote this last time I taught the poem. This doesn't really speak to what I'm talking about now, but basically, I think you get the gist of what's going on here. Does anybody have any questions then about this poem? So this poem, written in the 50s, 60s, dealing with the Cold War, which is different than a kind of hot war. So, I mean, different insofar as what we were afraid of course, was nuclear destruction. And what we were afraid of course, was complete annihilation. And I think the darkness beneath the night's darkness, the dream darkness, might be this kind of fear, this kind of, might be a kind of sign of this. Any questions then about this poem? Let me just give you a little quick rundown on the poets. So I'm not going to read the Seamus Heaney poem, although it's very good, and I hope you will read it and like it. It's just long, and I don't think we have the energy or time to really wrestle with it today. But these are British artists that I'm arguing are post-colonial, meaning that they're interested in the same way that African American and Native American poets today are interested in the finding some kind of colonial remnant of colonialism in the relationship between Native Americans and African Americans and the country, right? So because we colonized the Indians first, and then we enslaved Blacks and brought them here in order to build economic prosperity. Both of these moves are deeply violent, and they leave their mark. And so post-colonial writers are trying to figure out how to talk about that mark that's still left afterwards, right? And then you have these neo-realist writers like Ted Hughes, Dylan Thomas, who we are not going to read, but is a wonderful, wonderful, also Welsh poet. And then finally, the Cambridge School that we're going to turn to now, which is, I think, more experimental. So these are all sort of post-war, I don't know what you would call them, post-war schools of poetry that sort of come about in England. So arguably, whereas the 19th century was the century of the great British poets, I mean, obviously Whitman and Dickinson are amazing American poets, but let's just say that maybe that you give the nod to England in the 19th century. I think in the 20th century, you have to give the nod to American poets. So I'm tracing out some English poets that I think are also amazing. And I'm leaving lots of them out, okay, because we don't have time. I want to look at this poem by Denise Riley. And again, we can hear her read it. You're also going to hear a very sonorous reading, almost ponderous, but this is just the way that Denise Riley reads. She's a contemporary poet, a wonderful poet, if you have a chance to read any of her work.
Shantang. It's true that anyone can fall in love with anyone at all. Later, they can't. Oof, oof. How much mascara washes away each day and internationally, making the blue one black. Come on, everybody, especially you girls. Each day, I think of something about dying. Does everybody? Do they think that, I mean? My friends, some answers. Gently unstrap my wristwatch. Lay it face down.
Okay. So this is very much, I think, on a certain sense, it's a feminist poem. It's a poem about what it means for women. At least I don't know if it's a feminist poem. That's the way I've always read it. She happened to write a number of books on feminism, which is what makes me think this. But let me just say about the poem some of the things that I think connected to the issues we've been looking at. First of all, I think this gently unstrap my wristwatch connects it back up with this issue of time and temporality that we talked about earlier. So, you know, Auden's our bias. The depth beneath the depth in the Pike poem. In other words, the kind of whatever lies underneath life and death, right? Which are the issues I think that she's talking about here. I really like this poem, but I find that I don't have a ton to say about it. Let me simply say that she did study with Jeremy Prynne at Cambridge, as did a number of poets that I really admire. And what the Cambridge School poets do is I write here that they use idiom and vernacular in order to cut through dried up poetic voice, but they're not all the same. So some of the other poets like John Wilkinson, he has a much more experimental technique. I think that Denise Riley, who's also a philosopher, has a more direct voice. I don't have a whole lot to say about this poem except that I really admire it and like it. It's funny. I think it's a little funny and sad. Okay. I think a couple things to just hold on to. If you're thinking about, if you're thinking about the many ways the poem signifies, I would think about the word face, and that the face is the face of the watch, of course, but it's also our face, and it's also that which shows our feelings and emotions. It's also that which shows our age. And I think that laying the wristwatch face down means to not look at time, but also to admit a desire to sort of mask the face or hide the face. Okay. All right. One
I have
last
a question.
Yeah, please, please, please.
What does the name of the poem mean? Is that I'm not familiar with that word.
I looked it up once before and now I've forgotten. Hold on. Let's look for meaning. It's a kind of material, I think, for a dress, but I'm not certain of that. So let's see. Let's see. My memory is not so great. Yeah, it's a fabric. You see, a bridesmaid's dress. So you can see why it's a kind of fabric that's very, very connected to femininity, being married, etc. I happen to know that Denise Riley, because I met her a few times, that Denise Riley was married and divorced, right? And that yes, so that could be part of it. And she has a couple kids. Actually, one died, unfortunately, not too long ago, and she wrote a beautiful book about that. But okay, thank you. It's a good question. And oof oof actually is, you can look up oof oof in the dictionary too. It's a maybe a French saying, but it basically is just a saying of like exhaustion or like, oh my God, you know, so you can look that up too. I've looked it up in past classes. I'm skipping over this nice Seamus Heaney poem. Next time I might not assign it because I think it's too long. All right. And look at this poem by Flynn, which I think is really interesting. This is just to show you the many ways that poetry can go at this time. You'll notice that these are kind of short lyric poems. I think it's true that the majority of poets writing today are writing in shorter forms. Yeah, I mean, there are outliers, but they're rare. Okay, so this poem is called Without Me. Once in the hiatus of a difficult July, down Eskra's lorryless roads from sweet fuck all, we were flinging such young sophisticates, like a giant frisbee, this plastic lid of an old rat poison bin. We were flinging it from you to me to you, you to me, you, me, you back again. And you would have sworn that its flat arc was a pendulum, compassing Tyrone's prosy horizon. And I would have sworn that our throw and catch had such momentum that its rhythm might survive somehow without me. All right, a very short poem, but she had been a sort of language poet. Language poets were poets that that were interested in proliferating meanings by using strange language or putting language together in strange combinations. That's the best I can do. You don't need to know. If you want to know more about it, take a poetry class with me and we'll look at language poets. But That's the best I could do in this short time. But she's sort of post that, so she's now kind of returning to a kind of intelligibility, a kind of clarity. But inside this clarity is still this kind of like joy in language and the sound of language, right? A plastic lid of an old rat poison bin is just a great like line just to hear the language coming out. Or Tyrone's prosy horizon is another example of really great language. What I want to sort of say to you though is that I think the poem has another meaning, which I think ties it back to all the other poems we've looked at today. And that is that if you imagine what happens between two people is being like this frisbee, or in this case, a plastic lid being thrown between them, then what you get really is you get this interaction between two people being a metaphor for time and movement, right? And where do I get the time and movement? I get it through the word pendulum, which you know is something that works very much like a clock, like a grandfather's clock or something. It also shows the movement of the earth, right? And then I get it through the words momentum and rhythm. So what I'm trying to suggest to you is that what these poets are sort of interested in doing is, and I think in this poem, the real question is, can the momentum and rhythm and shared temporality that we have exist after one of us is gone, no longer part of the relationship or whatever? Do our memories have that, right, sort of ability? This to me seems to be a deeply romantic kind of, by romantic, I don't mean Hallmark cards, I mean the romantic poets, a deeply modern worry, you know, can the rhythms that we set up, our throwings and our catchings, survive our passing, right? This seems to me to be a very similar kind of question that on a personal level, the question for Ted Hughes and W.H. Auden seemed to be, can humanity survive, right? Can humanity survive fascism? Can humanity survive the Cold War? You know, Pike, or the kind of bias that's created, ideological bias that's created by thinking about history instead of noticing where we are. And then I think Denise Riley's concern with time is about what effects it has on us as people, right? As you get older, you definitely want to say, my friends, some answers, you know, like, what am I supposed to do? I'm getting older, you know, how do I negotiate this? And I think finally, this question about can we trust these things that happen to us? This is a deeply human problem, right? So can we trust that these things that happen between us still have the same power and so forth when we are gone? Okay, so that's really all I have to say about these poems today. So do you have any questions for me? They can also be questions about, although I don't I might not have the answers. There may be questions about the final. No. Thank you, Bree. Bree sent us a message informing us that Shantung is in fact silk. So that's really useful. Okay.
Do you know how many like
Yes.
essay questions there will be?
Oh, good question. I'm going to say 3.
Okay, thank
Yeah,
you.
my guess is there will be 3 essay questions, and they will count for more, just as it was before, than the multiple choice questions. In
Thank you.
fact, I think there'll be very few multiple choice questions, if I were to guess, somewhere around 5. And it will only focus on things post midterm. That much I know. Any other questions that I might be able to answer or might not? Okay, well then I will see you on Thursday. Thursday we'll have a review of, I'll have a better idea, I'll be able to tell you how to study. We'll do a little bit of review, sort of catching up on the class, although I tried to do some of that today, sort of talking about how some of the themes, what the arc, the trajectory of the class has been and where some of the themes leave us. But I think that we'll try to do a little bit more of that on Thursday. And have a good couple of days. Good luck with all of your other classes as we come to an end. And I'll see you on Thursday. Bye.